I was standing maybe 12 feet away when it started. Not because I was looking for anything to happen. I wasn't one of those people with their phones already up, hunting for content. I was just cold. October in London does this thing where the cold doesn't arrive all at once, it creeps in through your collar, through the gaps in your gloves, through the soles of shoes you thought were thick enough. I had my hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea from the little cart near the Victoria Memorial, the kind of tea that's too hot to drink but too warm to put down. The guards were there. 2 of them. Positioned at the gate like they'd been poured into place and left to set overnight. I always thought I understood what those men were. Living statues. Props for the postcard. Part of the architecture of the place, like the iron gates and the golden Queen Victoria on her marble throne across the road. You look at them long enough and they stop feeling real. That's the trick the uniform plays on you, the bearskin hat, the red tunic, the rifle, the absolute stillness, it all adds up to something that doesn't read as human anymore. It reads as symbol. I'd been in London 4 days. Solo trip. The kind you take when something in your life falls apart quietly and you need geography to do what therapy hasn't. I won't bore you with the details of the falling apart. What matters is I was there, alone, drinking cheap cart tea, watching the changing of the guard crowd start to thin out, when I noticed the man. He was maybe 50. American, I'd find out later, from somewhere in the middle of the country where, apparently, nobody had told him that there are things you simply do not do. He had a wife. She was standing slightly apart from him, holding a shopping bag from Harrods with the posture of a woman who had long since stopped being responsible for whatever her husband was about to do. She had that look. The practiced look. The look that says, I love him but, this is yours now, not mine. He was filming on a phone. Moving along the fence line, getting close. Too close. The kind of close that everyone in the crowd clocked but nobody said anything about, because there's this group paralysis that happens in tourist spots. Everyone waits for someone official to handle it, and the waiting creates this window where things can escalate. The guard didn't move. Didn't blink. Facing forward, rifle in front, bearskin hat making him look 7 feet tall even though he was probably 5'11". The man said something into his phone. Some commentary for his followers, I assumed. A little laugh. Then, he turned toward the guard, fully turned, fully facing him and held up his own cup of tea. It was one of those paper cups from a cafe down the road. Green logo. The tea inside steaming visibly in the cold air. He said, loud enough for those of us nearby to hear, think he wants some? Guards gotta be freezing, right? A few people laughed. The nervous kind of laugh. The kind that's really just a social reflex, something to fill a space that's suddenly uncomfortable. The guard didn't move. The man stepped closer. And this is where the morning stopped being ordinary. He extended the cup, actually extended it, toward the guard's face, close enough that the steam would have hit the man's cheek, and said, with this grin that I can only describe as the grin of someone who has never once been told no by anything that mattered, "Come on, mate. Have a sip. You look like you need it." He said mate. An American in London for 4 days, calling a Queen's Guard mate, waving scalding tea at his face. The crowd had gone very quiet. Not silent. There were still buses on the mall, still pigeons doing their pigeon business, still the distant sound of a police radio somewhere. But the people around us, 20, maybe 25 of them, had stopped their own conversations. Phones were coming up now. Not mine. I hadn't moved. I was watching the guard's face and thinking, there is something happening behind those eyes. Not anger. Not quite. Something more controlled than anger. Something that anger is made of, before it's anger. The raw ingredient. The man laughed again and pushed the cup a half-inch closer. That was when the guard moved. Not the way you'd expect. Not a lunge, not a shout, not the dramatic stamp of the foot that they do to warn tourists who get too close. This was different. This was one deliberate step to the side, precise, military, like a door closing, and then, he was at the edge of his post, at the line you're not supposed to cross, facing the man dead on. And he spoke. I want to be careful here because I want to get this right. The royal guard spoke. In that deep, controlled voice that sounds like it comes from somewhere below the chest, somewhere structural, sir. Step back from the post. 5 words. Quiet enough that only the front row of us heard them. But, the effect moved backward through the crowd like a wave. People who hadn't heard him somehow still stepped back, reading it in the posture of those who had. The American blinked. The grin flickered. He'd wanted a statue. He'd gotten a man. There's a difference. A vast, canyon-wide difference. And it hit him in real time, right there in front of all of us, the recalibration, the sudden awareness that the thing he'd been treating like furniture had a heartbeat and a voice and, behind those eyes, something ancient and patient and entirely unimpressed with him. The wife touched his arm. The shopping bag crinkled. He lowered the cup. And that would have been enough, that would have been a perfectly complete story. The guard speaks, the tourist backs down, everyone disperses into the grey London morning, except it didn't end there. Because the tea, in the lowering, splashed. Not a lot. Not a dramatic spill. Just a wave over the rim of the paper cup, maybe 2 tablespoons of scalding liquid, catching the edge of the guard's tunic. The red wool, the brass buttons. The American said, oh, sorry, I didn't mean, and the guard looked down at the stain on his uniform. Then, looked back up. The expression on his face in that moment, I have thought about it every day since. Because it wasn't rage. It wasn't humiliation. It was something so composed, so absolutely interior, that it almost looked like pity. Like he felt something for the man standing in front of him that was adjacent to pity but sharper. The way a surgeon might look at someone who's just made their own situation significantly worse. He said nothing. He returned to his position. Squared. Rifle forward. Eyes ahead. The crowd exhaled. The American's wife put her hand on the small of his back and steered him firmly toward the gate, the way you steer a child away from something they've touched and shouldn't have. I watched them go. I drank my tea. It had gone lukewarm. I didn't mind. What I didn't know yet, what none of us standing there knew, was that the moment wasn't over. It had only just introduced itself. The real part, the part one still can't fully explain to people when I tell this story at dinner parties and watch their faces go through the same sequence mine did, that was still 10 minutes away. And it involved the guard moving again. Voluntarily. Away from his post, you have to understand the geography of the place to understand what happened next. The Victoria Memorial sits at the end of the mall like the period at the end of a very grand sentence. Buckingham Palace behind it. The park to the left. And, in front, the roundabout, the traffic, the tourists orbiting the memorial itself, which has steps going up to it and a kind of viewing platform where people sit and eat and take photos of the palace gates from a decent distance. That's where she was. A little girl. Maybe 6. Maybe 7. One of those children who are all coat, enormous puffy coat, just legs sticking out the bottom, red Wellington boots, a knit hat with a pom-pom that had seen better days. She'd been sitting on the memorial steps with who I assumed were her grandparents, an older couple with a thermos and sensible shoes, the kind of grandparents who plan outings properly and bring their own drinks. At some point in the chaos of the tea incident, while everyone had been watching the American, while the crowd had pulled that collective held breath, the little girl had wandered. Stepped down off the memorial. Drifted, the way small children drift, following something only they can see. She was in the road. Not the main road, not the mall itself, which had barriers and police, but the inner ring of the roundabout, the narrower lane where vehicles doing a slow loop to exit toward Buckingham Palace Gate could come through. A black cab was coming around the bend. Slow. Very slow. The driver hadn't seen her yet. Wouldn't have, for another 5 or 6 seconds, and even then, there was probably time, probably the car would have stopped in time, probably, but probably is not a word you want applied to a 6-year-old in a puffy coat standing in a road. Here's the thing about the guard. I don't know how he saw her. His position at the gate faces forward, toward the mall, toward exactly where the American had been standing. The girl was to his left and, behind, across the road, in his peripheral vision at best. Maybe he caught the movement. Maybe he'd been tracking her without realizing it, the way parents track their children in crowds even when they're looking at something else, not a skill but an instinct, something in the hindbrain. Or maybe, and this is the part one keep coming back to, maybe he'd been watching all of us the entire time, me with my lukewarm tea, the American with his grin, the wife with her shopping bag, the grandparents with their thermos, the little girl with her pom-pom hat. Maybe those men see everything, all the time, and the stillness is an absence. Maybe it's the opposite of absence. He was across the road before I consciously registered him moving. Later, I tried to reconstruct it. He must have stepped off the post, must have crossed the pavement, waited for a gap in the outer lane, crossed, entered the roundabout, but I didn't see any of that as sequential steps. What I saw was, guard in position. Then, guard crouching in the road, one hand very gently on the little girl's shoulder, the other hand raised, palm flat, toward the approaching cab. The cab stopped. The girl looked up at him. This enormous man in a bearskin hat and a red tunic, crouching in a London road in October, the stain from cheap tourist tea still drying on his sleeve. She said something to him. I was too far away to hear what. He said something back. Still crouching. Still at her eye level. She laughed. She actually laughed, the small, clear sound that cut right through the traffic noise and the ambient crowd and the distant police radio, and I felt something move in my chest that I was not prepared for. Not a dramatic something. Just a small shift. The kind your ribcage makes when something real happens near you and your body clocks it before your brain does. He stood. Took her hand, this massive gloved hand, around this tiny mittened one, and walked her back across the road to the memorial steps, where the grandparents had just turned around and were in the early stages of realizing she was gone. The grandmother made a sound. Not a scream. Shorter than a scream. The compressed version. The sound of terror arriving just after the danger has already passed, which is somehow worse than if it had arrived at the same time. The grandfather was on his feet. Coming toward them. The grandmother behind him. The guard delivered the girl to them, that's the word, delivered, because there was a formality to it, a care, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else, and you were acutely aware of that, and stood back. The grandfather grabbed the little girl and held her the way grandfathers hold children they almost lost. The grandmother turned to the guard. And, here is the part one replay. She took his hand. Both of her hands around his gloved one. She was crying, not performing crying, not the polite social moisture that happens when people are moved, genuinely crying, her chin doing the thing, her eyes completely liquid. And, she said something to him. Quietly. I don't know what she said. Whatever she said, she meant it at a cellular level. The guard, and I need you to understand that these men are trained to receive gratitude the way walls receive weather, with stillness, with no visible response. This guard nodded. Just once. A single, slow nod. But, his eyes, I could see his eyes from where I was standing, because I drifted closer without meaning to, the way everyone had. We were all gravitating toward this thing that was happening. His eyes were not the eyes of a man receiving weather. They were the eyes of a man who was briefly, completely human. Then, he turned. Crossed the road. Returned to his post. Squared. Rifle forward. Eyes ahead. The crowd stood still for a moment. One of those rare moments when a group of strangers, none of whom know each other, none of whom will ever meet again after this gray October morning, all feel the same thing at the same time. There's a word for it in some languages. English doesn't quite have it. That collective catching of breath that is also a collective recognition, something just happened here. Something real. Then, someone started clapping. I don't know who. It spread, the way those things spread. Before you can decide whether or not you're the kind of person who claps, you're already clapping. The guard did not react. Of course he didn't. But, I watched his shoulders. Just for a second, before he was fully back in position, fully returned to stillness. And, I will swear on anything you ask me to swear on that his shoulders lifted, very slightly, and settled. Not a bow. Not an acknowledgement in any official sense. Something smaller than that. Something private. The kind of thing you don't do for an audience. The kind of thing that escapes the body before you can stop it. The American was still there. He'd stopped a little distance away, his phone lowered, watching what had just unfolded with an expression I didn't expect. Not embarrassment. Past embarrassment. Something quieter. Something that takes up more space than embarrassment. His wife said nothing. The Harrods bag hung at her side. He looked at the guard. Then, looked at his phone. Then, in what I believe was the most significant thing he did all morning, he put the phone in his pocket. Just put it away. I sat on the memorial steps for a while after that. The grandparents were there too, the little girl between them, the pom-pom hat askew, eating something from a packet she'd produced from somewhere inside the enormous coat. Children are remarkable. One near miss in a London road and she was eating biscuits and kicking her Wellington boots against the marble step. The grandmother caught my eye at one point. I don't know why. Maybe because I was alone, or maybe because she'd seen me standing there, watching, from the beginning. She gave me a look that I can't really describe. Not a smile. Something more tired than a smile. Something that said, I know. I know what that was. I nodded. I thought about the guard. Standing at his post. Stain drying on his sleeve. Completely still. Nobody would look at him now and see a prop. Nobody in that crowd, nobody who'd been standing there, could unsee what they'd just seen. The discipline it takes. The discipline to hold yourself in stillness while the world outside your post does whatever it does, the arrogant tourists, the careless crowds, the children drifting toward traffic, and to stay in position, and to break from position only when breaking is the only possible right thing, and then to return to stillness as though none of it had touched you. What does that cost? What does a man carry, standing in the cold outside a palace, hour after hour, holding that kind of stillness? I didn't know. I still don't. But I thought about my own falling apart, which had seemed, before this morning, before the tea and the little girl and the grandmother's hands large and shapeless and significant. It still was all those things. But something had shifted in the ordering of it. I want to tell you the ending. But endings, real ones, are never quite where you expect them. The ending of this story happened the next morning. And it involved a letter. I went back the next morning. I don't have a good rational explanation for why. I told myself it was because I wanted to walk through St. James's Park before the weekend crowds arrived. I told myself I hadn't finished the tea from the same cart the day before and wanted to do it properly. I told myself a lot of things. None of them were the real reason. The real reason was the guard. Not this guard specifically, I knew there was almost no chance it would be the same man. They rotate. They have shifts and rosters and a whole internal machinery that the public never sees. The man who had crossed the road for that little girl, who had stood with a tea stain drying on his tunic and a grandmother's hands around his glove, he was somewhere else now. Sleeping, maybe. Eating breakfast. Being ordinary in whatever way he was ordinary when the uniform came off. But I wanted to stand in the place where it happened. That sounds strange. I know it sounds strange. There's a kind of grief that attaches itself to places, not people. A need to return to the geography of something that moved you, as if the ground has retained something of the event, some charge. I'm not religious. I'm not particularly mystical. But I understand now why people leave flowers at accident sites. Why they go back to the spot on the beach where something shifted. The place holds what you can't fully carry. The morning was colder than the day before. Proper cold now. The sky doing that London thing where it can't decide between cloud and something worse and settles on both. The tourists were thinner on the ground, too early, too cold. Just the serious ones. Photographers with actual cameras. A woman sketching in a notebook. An old man feeding birds with the dedication of a professional. The guards were different men. Tall and still and utterly sealed. I stood where I'd stood the day before. Same approximate patch of pavement. I drank my tea, which was better this time because I asked for it with the extra bag, and I watched the morning happen around the palace gates. I was about to leave, genuinely about to turn and walk into the park when I saw the couple. The grandparents. They came around the corner from the direction of Buckingham Gate, the proper way, like people who had looked up directions rather than drifting in from the tube. He had his thermos again. She had a flat paper bag tucked under her arm, the kind that holds a card or a folded letter. They weren't there for the sightseeing. They went to the nearest guardsman. This new guard, a different man, unrelated to yesterday entirely. And the grandmother spoke to him, politely, formally, the way you speak to someone you know has a job to do and you don't want to interfere with the doing of it. I was close enough to catch pieces. Yesterday, the man at this post. Our granddaughter, she wandered into the. We didn't get a chance to properly. The guard, this new guard, who knew nothing, listened. Then, he spoke to her in a low voice. Nodded. And he accepted the paper bag. Just accepted it. The way the institution accepts things on behalf of its people. She'd written a letter. Or the grandfather had. Or maybe both of them, the handwriting switching halfway through the way old couples share tasks. You do the first half, I'll finish. I don't know what was in it. I'll never know. But I watched this woman hand it over and I watched her do something after she handed it over that undid me completely. She straightened. This woman, who was probably 70, who had cried the kind of crying yesterday that doesn't leave your face for hours, who had almost, she straightened her spine and gave a small formal nod toward the gate. Not at the guard who was holding her letter. At the gate itself. At the palace behind it. At whatever the whole thing represented to her. It was a thank you aimed past the individual, past the uniform, past the institution, at something she felt the institution was supposed to mean. I don't know if it means that thing. I don't know if any institution, anywhere, in the world as it currently stands, lives up to what the people who believe in it believe it represents. That's above my pay grade. That's above everyone's pay grade. But what I know is that she believed it. In that moment, on that cold October morning, this woman believed that the man who had taken her granddaughter's hand in a London road had done it in the name of something larger than himself. And she wanted that larger thing to know she was grateful. The grandfather touched her elbow. They left. I sat on a bench. A pigeon arrived immediately and investigated my shoe with the grim determination of a detective who has followed a bad lead but is committed to seeing it through. I watched it. My tea finished. My hands going cold. I thought about the American. I wondered if he'd slept well. I wondered if he'd told the story to anyone at dinner, on the phone home, and how he'd told it. Whether he was the villain in his own version or whether the story had reformed itself in the night the way stories do, the inconvenient edges smoothed down, the comfort parts enlarged. Maybe he hadn't told it at all. Maybe he'd just carried it. I thought about discipline. What it actually means. Not the word you use for children or soldiers, but the real thing, the interior thing, the capacity to hold yourself in a shape that doesn't come naturally, for a purpose larger than your own comfort, for hour after hour in the cold, while the world runs its full spectrum of stupidity and need right past your nose. I thought about the little girl in the Wellington boots. Eating biscuits like nothing happened. Children are either the most resilient beings on the planet or they simply haven't learned yet to understand how close things can get. I don't know which. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the Wellington boots and the biscuits and the pom-pom hat were the point that childhood preserved intact is worth a man crossing a road and raising his hand to a cab and kneeling down in the cold to say whatever he said that made her laugh. It's worth all of it. I left London 2 days later. At the airport I did something I haven't admitted to anyone. I bought a postcard from one of the terminal shops. The standard tourist one, Buckingham Palace, the guards, the gates, the whole visual shorthand for a country and its particular way of performing its own history. Normally I'd never buy something like that. Too generic. Too much of a cliché for the kind of traveler I preferred to imagine myself as. I bought it anyway. Not to send. I didn't write anything on it. I just kept it. Tucked it in my notebook, where it's been ever since. I look at it sometimes. Not because I think the institution is perfect, or the country is, or that men in bearskin hats are the point of anything. That's not what the postcard means to me. It means the morning. It means the tea and the crowd and the particular sound of a child's laugh cutting through London traffic. It means what a man does when the world is watching and what a man does when the world has turned away, and the way those two things, if you're lucky, if you've built yourself right, are exactly the same. The stain would have been cleaned by the regiment's quartermaster by the time the guard came back on duty. These things are attended to. The uniform matters, the uniform is part of the point. But, under the clean tunic, in the body of the man wearing it, whatever happened when that grandmother held his gloved hand, that, I think, doesn't wash out. It stays. The way the cold stays, the way the gray October sky stays, the way the sound of that letter going into a paper bag and being handed through a fence stays. All the things that nobody filmed. I told you this story would end with a letter. But, the letter isn't the ending. The ending is this: when you strip away the uniform, the history, the ceremony, the whole elaborate theater of institution and tradition, what you had, on that morning, was a person who saw a child in danger and did not deliberate. Moved. Just moved. Everything else, the American's humiliation, the grandmother's gratitude, the crowd's applause, my postcard in a notebook, these words you're reading right now, everything else is the ripple. The stone was a man in a cold road, holding a small hand. That's it. That's the whole story. The pom-pom was purple, by the way. I didn't mention that before. I don't know why it matters, but it does. It really does.